to the Banker video on the top 1,000 World Bank ranking for Asia Pacific. I'm Kimberly Long, Asia editor at The Banker, and I'm joined now by Joy McKnight, editor at The Banker. Joy, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Kim.
So to begin with, I'm going to ask you for a bit of an overview really of this year's top 1,000 banking. So how have we seen the ranking change this year? And also there was an element of the US dollar being particularly strong this year, which has had an impact. So what have we seen that reflected in the results?
Well, it's very interesting. So we've seen a bit of contraction in sort of the three main metrics of the ranking. Obviously, the main ranking is done by Tier 1 capital, and there was a small contraction, about 2%, in terms of the overall top 1,000 World Banks ranking for Tier 1 capital. But we also track total assets. Again, there was a small decline of 1.5% in total assets, and pre-tax profits, which saw a decline of about 6.5%. But you really need to look at that in comparison to last year when there was a 50% rise in pre-tax profit. So yeah, a bit of a contraction, but I have to say, just to your point about the strong US dollar, that was really the major impact across the ranking. And of course, the dollar appreciated about 12% against the British pound, about 9% against the Chinese yuan, about 7% against the euro over the course of 2022. So that made the biggest impact on the banking, on the totality of the top 1,000. However, if you look at assets, if you look at loans, if you look at deposits, in actual fact, everything is pretty stable. The banks are very well capitalized, and I think they're preparing for what's to come. But obviously, we're here to talk about Asia Pacific, and the Chinese banks, again, top 4 mega banks are at the top of the ranking. But what else have you seen in terms of the analysis that you've done throughout the region?
Yeah, like you say, so the Chinese banks, once again, top of the top 1,000 as standard now, really. ICBC is still in that top position. But what's interesting this year is, as you say, with the strength of the US dollar, ICBC last year had gone into the $500 billion Tier 1 capital category, but this year has slightly fallen below that, basically because of the strength of the US dollar. We've also seen Bank of Communications is now in 9th place, having climbed up 1 place this year in the rankings. So we're seeing the Chinese banks really climbing up the rankings now. And also there's a couple more just outside the top 10. And it's possible that they will actually break into the top 10 next year. So we could actually start seeing like a majority Chinese banks in the top 1,000 overall ranking, which is kind of a huge shift, really, if we look back historically when we see more European and US banks in the top 1,000, top 10. So that's a real change there. We've also seen as well the digital banks really growing in strength. So overall, there was a big decline in the Tier 1 capital based on the strength of the US dollar. There was only a couple of banks that saw even below 1% growth. But if you look at like WeBank and MyBank, the digital-only banks, they both saw growth in Tier 1 capital, which I think really demonstrates the strength of those banks actually within China now that they've been able to book that trend in the decline to actually see growth as well there.
Excellent. So in the top 10, we see 5 Chinese banks, 4 American banks, 1 UK bank, European bank. Obviously, last year, Japan dropped out of the top 10, but Indonesian banks did really well last year. What's happened this year?
So yeah, we've seen MUFG have not the best year this year. We've seen them decline down to 14th place with an 11% drop in Tier 1 capital. And that really is reflective of the general story for the Japanese banks now. They're really seeing a decline in Tier 1 capital, even with the adjustments in mind of the strength of the US dollar. What we have seen, though, is, again, with the digital banks doing quite well. So Rakuten Bank, which is digital-only bank, they saw a 3% increase in Tier 1 capital, which really bucked the trend for the Japanese banks. And we've also seen, too, there's a lot of local and small regional banks in Japan, and some of them have struggled a bit in recent years. So we've started to see some mergers there. So we saw 2 new banks enter the top 1,000 this year based off the back of mergers of some of the smaller banks. So I think that might be a story going forwards there, is that we might see fewer Japanese banks because of the mergers, but actually they'll be stronger. So that could be an emerging story in future years for Japan. And onto Indonesia. So yeah, they had a great year last year, but unfortunately not so well this year, which is almost surprising considering the country had such a strong economic result this last year as well. So that's quite a bit of a bad story for them. But we did also see a couple of Indonesian banks enter the top 1,000 as well. So there is that possibility that the banks overall might be gaining in some strength. It's just that the tier 1 capital growth isn't quite there anymore.
Okay, great. And then outside China, Japan, and Indonesia, what are the other emerging market trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think if you look at the regional results, it's actually a really interesting story because we've seen banks like in Vietnam, for example, have really grown in strength. So where we have the highest movers ranking for the Asia Pacific, excluding Japan and China ranking, there's 8 Vietnamese banks in the top 10 overall, which is really quite a big result, you know, for the country. And also if you look on the return on assets ranking as well, that's a really interesting story because Papua New Guinea and Kazakhstan kind of dominate the top 5 of that position where, you know, they're not really the biggest players overall in the top 1,000 ranking. So it's a really interesting story to see when you break it down across the region to the more specific nitty-gritty outside of the tier 1 capital results, how the banks are performing. So I think that's quite an interesting story there if you break it down into the more regional banks to see what's happening there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Kim.
Thank you.
So you can read all about Kim's analysis of the Asia Pacific region, as well as the best performing banks on the top 1,000 on thebanker.com/top 1,000.